The first thing I did was make my homepage more mobile friendly. The About section and the image of me did not play nice when the screen hit around 800 pixels, so I added a media query to line up the content on top of each other instead of next to each other when the screen hit that size. I also added scaling to my logo so that when the screen size gets really small, the logo doesn't get tiny. Here is a demo of my homepage. Next, I worked on my features component. Originally, I looked up each article by the order in which it appears on the page, and then I gave it a background image. This method does not put content first, however. So I gave each article a descriptive ID and applied the background image based on the ID. Doing it this way allows me to target each article based on content rather than being based on the order in which they appear on the page. For my About People component, I originally could not figure out how to place the content correctly over the images. To make up for that, I used specific padding and negative margin values based on the size of the screen. This method was very convoluted and not optimal at all. To fix that, I figured out that giving the content an absolute position and its containing element a relative position would allow me to move the content anywhere I wanted within the container. So I applied the position properties and then gave the content a top position of 0, which lined up the content and its container perfectly. The next step was to give the content a width and a height so that the darkened overlay would cover the entire image. Finally, I added some top padding to each H3 tag to move the content to the center of its container. One issue I ran into when I implemented this was that each article was a little bit bigger than the image it contained. I tried setting the padding and margin to 0, but that did nothing. So I researched it a bit more and found that images are by default display inline. This caused the sizing to be off by just a small amount. To make the articles the same size as the image, all I had to do was make each image display block. By changing all of this to a more optimized solution, I was able to remove almost all of my media queries that I needed with the other solution, to sort of rig the component to have the same behavior. Next, I wanted to remove the HR tag since it wasn't critical to any content. I used the after class to place an object with the top border and a set width right below each person's job position. This created the same look as before. I also got rid of all of my classes that I used to have in the HTML and instead looked things up by child properties. Here is a demo of this component. For my blog component, I removed all negative margins. I instead added a positive margin to an element right below the element that had a negative margin, and achieved the same effect. I also italicized some of the content that was supposed to be italicized. Components 7, 8, and 9 also had some negative margins. I removed those and achieved the same effect by using a relative position on the elements that had the negative margin and using the right modifier to move the element in the desired location. Doing it this way removes the negative margins which don't take into account the depth or z-index and uses a modifier that does take into account the z-index. Finally, my footer component now looks up the social media links by their href value rather than the order in which they appear. Doing it this way makes content the #1 priority instead of giving priority to the order in which the elements appear on a page. Over the course of this month, I think my biggest failure was with week 2. At times I lost track of the idea of focusing exclusively on content. I also did not initially take into account what was actually content and what was something that I could easily add using CSS. I think my greatest success came in week 3. I feel that for the most part, I was able to optimally recreate each component while keeping CSS semantics in mind. Before I took this class, I gave almost no thought to what content truly was and how I can use HTML for content only and use CSS to do the rest. After taking this class, I have learned how to determine what kind of tag each HTML element should be and why it should be that over something else. I have also noticed when I keep the idea of HTML is content only in mind, I create much cleaner HTML files. They are easier to read through and figure out the hierarchy of the page. It also makes my CSS much cleaner and easier to follow by not having any extras in the HTML file. I also learned a lot about HTML and CSS semantics and the proper way to implement different elements for a website. I think through the knowledge that I have gained from this class, I will be able to create much more efficient and optimized websites in the future. I will also be able to communicate the content of a website in a much simpler and cleaner fashion. And finally, I will remember to think about what is actual content and what should be created using CSS.